microphone at? Oh, he took it with him. Okay. Yeah, I can use a special microphone. You have to kind of lean in for that one, though.
For the bleeding hearts and artists and Fedora people and Qt people and OpenSUSE people and I don't know, you're wearing a GIMP shirt. Excellent. Welcome everybody. We are here to bridge the gap between artists and developers and Wayland and, well, build all the bridges, Qt bridges maybe. Here's Joshua Goins, who will tell you all about it.
All right, hello. Is someone going to close the door, please? Thank you. Because the noise is really distracting for me. That's why I've been such a bum about it when I'm speaker support. But today I'm going to talk about you for bridging the gap between artists and Wayland. And of course, this relates to all the other Wayland talks that had happened over the course of the 2 days. And I have quite the interesting slot because they decided to put me against all these interesting lightning talks. So thank you very much for picking my talk. There's less people in here than I expected, but that just means you all will just have firsthand experience of my amazing presentation, right? And I also apologize for the, I put quite an interesting color palette for all these slides you'll see very soon. So I apologize if the readability is affected at all. For most of them, it's fine, but some of the text is a little unreadable, so sorry about that. So what are we going to talk about is sort of the Wayland problem, switching to Wayland by default, and of course this affects artists. I'll get into the problems a little bit later, but first I wanted to introduce myself. What is my history with the KDE project and art in particular, and why you should care about my opinion over other people. My name is Joshua Goins, as I was introduced as, and my username online is Redstraight. I'm a digital artist in my free time because, of course, my free time is spent programming for KDE. So when I'm not doing that, I'm doing digital art, which is also all the slide backgrounds you'll see here. But I'm not a professional in any capacity, so my needs and professional artist needs are slightly different, even though they are related. And for the programming side, I've been contributing to KDE since 2022, 2023, so very recently. I'm also one of the Input Gold champions that was selected last year at the last Academy. I also maintain the Art on Wayland Redstraight website, which I'm sure some of you have probably seen before. It gives you like a basic overview of like the features that we have in our Wayland session that matter for artists, a short guide on how to transition to Linux and all that kind of fun stuff. Please don't read it during my talk because I'm going to talk about the same stuff, so that's kind of weird. I also been hacking on the drawing tablet KCM, which I'll explain in a moment. And also, I'll get into this in the next slide, but I've also touched pretty much every part of the Linux graphics tablet stack. So how did I really get started working on drawing tablet stuff? Because it's not every day that artists turn into programmers that then just work on stuff that artists need. Around 2022, 2023, I don't remember, I bought this XP Pen graphics tablet thing, and it was quite expensive, and it didn't work on Linux, or it didn't work on Linux. I'll get into more details about that later, but I got frustrated by that, and so I was like, how hard could it be to make it work on Linux? And then I got involved writing a kernel driver for it, and now it's upstream into Linux for 6.17, so if you just buy the tablet out of the box, you plug it in, it will just work. But it wasn't completely my own project. It was based off of an existing Digiment kernel driver that's like an out of tree graphics tablet drivers that is more like a staging area before they get upstream into the kernel. But I took up that work, and I'm also hacking on other tablets such as the closely related 24 Pro, the 15.6 Pro, and the normal 24-inch Pro as well. Those have not been upstream, so please don't crop for me. I'm going to do that when I come back home. So I want you all to close your eyes for a second and sort of imagine what you think the title of the talk means. You know, I'll talk about bridging the gap and all that kind of stuff. So like, you know what, never mind, don't close your eyes. I'm an artist, so I can just visualize it for you, right? So here's the situation. So I was too lazy to draw anything more complex. So on the left side, we have artists who are not either using Linux or they're maybe stuck on the X11 session. And on the right, we have our, the future. We have Wayland. We don't want to support X anymore. How do we sort of get these people onto our side, right? And I also want to kind of explain the situation, especially if you're not an artist or you're not really involved in the free and open source space, sort of the situation that we find ourselves in, and this is sort of related to the end of 10 talk from yesterday. Windows is becoming increasingly unpopular, as we've seen. They keep doing stupid stuff, but that's of great benefit to us, right? Because we can sort of fix the problems that they don't want to solve or are really creating for themselves. A lot of artists are moving away from Windows, away from Mac OS, onto operating systems like iPads for some reason, but also Linux has been of a great interest to a lot of artists out there in the world. And also proprietary art software is also becoming very unpopular. Stuff like Photoshop is increasing their subscription prices, or they're training your artwork and data sets and crappy stuff like that. So the rise for open source art programs has also been increasing, right? But ideally, we would want artists running free software art programs on free software operating systems, right? So this is, so the gap, so to speak, is that we kind of want artists to move to Wayland, but we weren't really prepared for them in the first place. Especially with the graphics tablet stuff, a lot of the user space components, Plasma and that kind of stuff, the input stack, a lot of it couldn't really be reused from the X11 session. I won't show a screenshot of it here, but for example, if you had a configuration tool for the X11 session to configure Wacom tablets, it was literally called like the Wacom settings tool or something like that, and that couldn't be reused at all. There's a whole lot of stuff that the ecosystem kind of had to like restart for. So there's a lot of catching up to do in that regard. But also back to back with Neil's talk, we talked about switching to Wayland by default for Plasma 6. So if we don't have the X11 session anymore, what do people do if for some reason, and I'll get into sort of more specific details, what if an artist needs a specific feature that was only in the X11 session but wasn't in the Wayland session? Well, they're kind of out of luck, right? So we had to kind of have a story to tell. We had to do a few improvements in that regard. So like when Plasma 6 says they're switching to Wayland, we also got a lot of negative feedback from artists, for example, and kind of still do. I'll get into that a little bit later. It's like, can Wayland actually be viable for artists, or is it like some kind of sick practical joke that we're playing on them? So, and I also want to explain why should we push KDE instead of something like GNOME? Well, we look like Windows, and that matters a lot to people. When we tell them to use Linux, it's much better to tell them to use KDE Plasma instead of something like weird that has its own paradigm, right? And people can argue that like we aren't just like Windows, but it is true we look a lot like Windows, and that I think that's a boon we should kind of like lean into a little bit more. KDE is also the umbrella organization for a lot of other applications like Krita and Kdenlive, and so artists are kind of special in this regard because they've heard of programs like Krita or Kdenlive already, and so when they hear that KDE is not just the people who make these applications but also a desktop environment, that's actually really important to them. It's sort of what David said in his talk yesterday. It's sort of this brand. He focused more on Plasma because he's a Plasma dev, but it also applies greatly to KDE, right? So it's really important, and it's really cool that we have applications like Krita and Kdenlive that are sort of underneath our umbrella, even if they aren't as closely related. I know, but it matters a lot to normal people, right? So let's now focus on KDE's artist story. And I'm gonna skip the recap because I have no time. So let's start building some bridges. So I'm gonna walk back a little bit and go sort of the changes that we had since Plasma 6. Because Plasma 6 is special in that regard, like I said earlier, and Neil said, that it switched to Wayland by default, so we focus a lot on the Wayland out-of-box experience, right? So especially if you aren't an artist or you're not involved in the graphics tablet infrastructure at all, you may be confused, like what does KDE Plasma actually provide? Like why do we care what kind of graphics tablet support KDE Plasma has? Well, we have to provide the basic infrastructure for graphics tablets. For example, you've moved the stylus, Quinn, our Wayland compositor, has to know how the stylus move and which application is focused so it can actually send that. That's sent through the Wayland protocol, of course. But I should mention that I'm not going to be covering applications at all because it's not really relevant, and also because I don't work on the application, so I can't speak on their behalf. And we also support configuring graphics tablets. So I mentioned earlier that we had the Wacom configuration tool in X11, but especially if you're not an artist, you may be confused, like what do you actually configure for a graphics tablet? Artists use tools like this on Windows and Mac OS. So this is just a crappy screenshot that I found online of the Wacom tool that you download on Windows. And you can do stuff like if the tablet has side buttons, you can configure what the side buttons do. If you have multiple monitors, you have to decide where the pen moves on the tablet relates to the monitors. Sometimes people want it on just one monitor like me. Sometimes they put it on the whole workspace for some reason, I don't know. All kinds of weird stuff. So when they're moving from Windows and Mac OS, which we want them to do, we kind of have a solution for this, and KDE Plasma is ideally the best place to put this instead of a driver. I'll kind of explain why later. So what did our drawing tablet KCM actually look like? Now, I don't have a Plasma 5 install. I don't know who still does. So I just had to find this image online. But you can sort of get an idea, even though it's dark theme, and I think it's even a different icon set. So like I said before, the Wacom tool has stuff for like monitor settings, so we have monitor settings. But you'll notice there's a whole lot less there than you would expect, right? So you can configure like pen buttons and pad buttons, but you could sort of just tell that it's just getting started and it needs a whole lot more work done on it. So to put the problems into more of an easy to understand bullet list, we don't have a lot of settings that are expected by artists. For example, Wacom tablets have this special like ring on the side that you can sort of zoom in and out for, and you can configure for other actions. But there's nothing like that in the Wayland KCM, right? So if, for example, you're upgrading your distribution that moved to a Wayland-only model, you're sort of stuck complaining on Reddit that they don't support configuring touch rings anymore. So that's kind of troublesome, right? And especially if your distro doesn't provide X11 anymore, you don't even have a way to fall back. So in another problem with the KCM, it has no real maintainership at this point. Again, this is the very tail end of Plasma 5.27, the only one I can actually speak with any confidence in because that's when I started. It was made by Alex at some point for some vendor, and it received some small bug fixes and features over the years as it existed. I don't know how long it existed. But it had no real like sort of leader behind it, how you would think with other Plasma components. And this is sort of where my story begins to intersect and where I kind of ask like, where's our bridge? So I kind of took it upon myself to build said bridge. So what kind of bridge did we build? Well, first I'm going to show you, we saw the old screenshot with all the very little settings you see in there. And now I'm going to show you the same KCM, but in Plasma 6.5. And I know the difference may not seem that big, but it is a way more complex KCM. It's also light theme, which is the better theme, by the way. But also, as you can tell, I like bullet lists, so I also put all the features that we added since Plasma 5.27 in a nice, hold on. Bullet list here. So we have like mapping to all screens, we have a tablet tester, we have remapping to mouse clicks, scroll wheels, multiple keybinds, and more. We have calibrations for really fancy graphics tablets, have even a built-in screen. We have a CLI configuration tool for advanced users who are used to exec Wacom, if that means anything to you. Nico added a relative mode. We have a global pressure curve in ranges, which is especially useful for applications who don't support it. We have support for the touch rings that I just said about Wacom tablets. That's in Plasma 6.5 specifically, along with dials, which you see on XP Pen and Huion tablets. The Quinn people have also shipped color management, so applications can actually be color managed on Wayland now. And there is also so much more that I cannot fit on this list. But as you can tell, we have made quite a bit of progress in Plasma 6, and I think I'm proud to say that you can never be too sure that as of Plasma 6.5, I forgot to put the disclaimer on that. It's only in Plasma 6.5. I think our Wayland session for artists is actually better than X11, big asterisks there. All the usual Wayland benefits apply, right? So you have better multi-monitor support, overall smoother session. There's just so much better about the Wayland session than our X11 session. We also have the better KCM. It has more support for tablets and brands. It's built on the same ecosystem that GNOME uses, so we know it's not going to go away anywhere. And also, I'll get into this a little bit later, but like if GNOME improves something, then we usually also get that improvement. There's also less magic incantations entered into like random config files. If you ever had to set up an R tablet on X11, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And there's also no like magical life hacks on Wayland. I know this is somehow a complaint for some artists who are used to, sort of the X11 session where they're able to configure every single kind of useless detail. But I think having it plug and play on the Wayland session is just much, much better for users in the long run. But of course, if you want to get like real power usery, we have the CLI tool for that, as I mentioned before. And people seem generally happy with this new direction. And I'll get into a little bit about the response specifically later. But to note, like almost every major 6.x release has had a new drawing tablet related feature. So we're getting pretty far into our goal, right? So now I have the previous image here, right? But now it has a bridge on it, so that seems pretty cool. And I know I just realized now today that Conky was holding a wrench and the bridge is wooden, but I'll just ignore that, right? So now you may be thinking, so we have a really featureful Wayland session, right? So how do we so now there's a bridge between these two islands. We have the artists who want to switch or maybe interested in switching, or maybe they just don't know they want to switch to begin with, although I think that's becoming more and more unlikely, right? And then we have our Wayland session, and now we have the bridge of all these new features that people can actually use soon. So how do we actually get artists to switch? So when we talk about getting artists to switch, we have to be really specific here, because like I mentioned before, there's people who are completely new to Linux who, of course, have to get used to all the quirks of Linux, even if they are dwindling, but also our existing X11 users who have maybe either stuck to X11 because their distro is super old, or are sticking to X11 because they knew at some point maybe that the Wayland session wasn't going to work for them. And we have to be really specific here because we are dealing with two different camps of people. I'll get into a little bit about that later. But also, we also have a social debt to overcome. And I think this was mentioned yesterday in some talk, that the Wayland session has been shamed and dunked on for years by artists and the general world. And in my opinion, it was kind of rightfully so. We did have problems. But now that we've sort of fixed some of those problems, it's now like a social debt that we have to overcome, right? So it's not only genuine problems, but also dealing with the preconceptions that people have either made in their mind or have already been told that people have said online. But I think years have passed. I say years, but Plasma 6.0 didn't release that long ago. I keep reminding myself that maybe it's time to try again, right? So, like I mentioned before, that when we're talking about the two different camps of people, I want to make sure our communication is key. So when we're talking to, for example, people who are completely new to Linux, is there really any point in mentioning Wayland? Like genuine question, is there any point in mentioning Wayland? I think as a Plasma 6.5 and you had a decent distribution, I think that you can actually downplay the Wayland part, right? No one introduces someone to Windows and then mentions whatever Windows compositing manager is, right? It's just not important for systems that actually work. Of course, that only applies if you believe my theory that the Wayland system does work, which I think it does. But the differences nowadays are so hilariously small that I think the only people who actually care about the Wayland part either have a genuine problem that we do know and we are trying to fix it, or they're just trying to rage bait you, and it's usually the latter part, right? But again, this only matters for new to Linux users, right? So if you have an existing X11 user who, of course, hasn't switched to the Wayland session yet, make sure their problems are solved, obviously. But when we ask how do we get artists to switch, they already have. I mentioned this to a few people already, but artists have already been switching to the Wayland session in just Linux in general, and it's been really great, especially during the late 5.x cycle and the great, of course, 6.x cycle, where it just looks like we keep improving even more rapidly than before. People have been switching, and I've known a few people who have switched, right? This year specifically, I've gotten direct messages from artists who just out of the blue just ask me random Wayland questions. And I'm serious here. Of course, I can't give it any names because I didn't ask permission for them to be blasted like this. But I'll look at their profile, right? And they're just some person. You can't tell from the outside that they actually use free and open source software, but they're just asked like, how can I do this on Wayland with like this tool that you made? And in my opinion, that's really great news, right? It's not just it means they feel comfortable to reaching out and that they're actually using the system and not just complaining about some problem they had, right? And wow, that's great, right? Like we're done, like the bridge is working, people are actually moving across the bridge and stuff like that. It's like the end of the talk, right? But it's not so fast. So like I mentioned, well, I didn't mention before actually, but some specialty hardware features are still missing. Of course, we support like Wacom touch rings, which actually solves a problem for a lot of people. I know a lot of people who are waiting to switch to the Wayland session just for touch rings alone, which is crazy to me, but that's great that we now solve that problem for them. But usually the more expensive hardware that you have, the less that it's actually supported, which is of course a problem with everything really, all kinds of hardware. But our own software is struggling in their own different ways on Wayland, for example, Krita. I should mention that a lot of this stuff is not really essential to work on Wayland. For example, Krita works great on Wayland through the X-Wayland layer. But if they want to take, for example, advantage of the Wayland native color management or some either fancy features that we have on the horizon, then they have to move to Wayland only. But they have been making really great progress on that. Like a week before Academy, they actually opened up a merge request to add native Wayland color management, which is insane how fast that developed. And I also should mention, we also have a two-way relationship with the Krita software. Of course, you would expect that in the KDE community. But like, for example, the Quinn developers will answer their various questions about Wayland. They've been super helpful with this. And then they also report these weird, obscure drawing tablet bugs in Qt or Quinn, and that we can actually get solved, which helps everybody, especially users, right? And the more bigger problem in the room, right? These are sort of just smaller problems, but driver support is still lacking. This is what I started my history with, and unfortunately, I have to end the talk with this as well. So now that the Wayland session is stable, and we get users to switch, it always just comes back to hardware, doesn't it? Instead of NVIDIA, now it's random Chinese manufactured tablets, right? So this is the biggest blocker, I think, now. Depending on the tablet brand, you may be able to plug in your device and it works. Some tablets, if you're lucky, have a compatibility mode that's really meant for like Android and stuff like that. So if they don't have a device driver to talk to, they'll send like predefined key events and stuff like that, but it's not ideal. Obviously, we'll get a lot of bug reports, for example, from like confused users, where they'll open up the drawing tablet KCM and really confused why we advertise, be able to configure the buttons and they can't configure the buttons. And then we sort of run around a little bit until we realize the model of the tablet and that it's not supported anywhere. So that kind of sucks. And it also sucks because they report it to us, but it's not really our problem, right? I mentioned I had to add a kernel driver for my tablet, and that's what you usually have to do. So you can't really ask all KDE developers to start developing kernel drivers, right? But the one upside, the one silver lining to the sort of dark cloud of driver support is that once people actually add more driver support, that benefits all desktop environments. So you could theoretically say that it's in the interest of every desktop environment, KDE and GNOME included, that we have people hacking on driver support, right? Because it benefits all of us in the end. And also you may be thinking like, yeah, why don't we just use the proprietary tools provided by vendors already? And there's actually a surprising amount of vendors. For example, XPPen has a proprietary user space driver for Linux that you can download, and it actually supports all of their devices. But in my personal opinion, not speaking on behalf of any project, I think doing it in user space is troublesome. So you download this tool, and basically what it does is it creates like a virtual input device that takes the tablet, USB, whatever, however connect it, and then translates it into like a fake drawing tablet device, basically in a very general terms. But then you can't use our great tablet KCM that I just showed you earlier, right? And also, that's not the only problem, I think. Obviously biased since I'm the drawing tablet KCM maintainer. But usually with these setups, you have to do like an extra step. For example, if you use the proprietary XP pen driver, you have to then install that package. You also have to find the website to begin with, right? Because we don't have like a Windows update type mechanism, at least not yet. I heard that's being changed in Discover. Also, for like some of the more open source solutions, you usually have to install an extra package, and you also have to regenerate stuff like your NitRAM FS. I don't think I can ever ask any artist to do that. Sometimes I barely have an idea what that means, and personally, I don't think that's really needed. Like, let Windows and macOS twist in the wind with all the weird setup they have to do for device drivers. Linux can and has done better in that regard, and I think we should just keep doing that. And when I mentioned kernel device driver, is that? Oh, that's a 5. When I mentioned the kernel device driver that I worked on, that's not really the true solution that the kernel people are facing, or specifically HID subsystem people. They really don't want people to keep writing custom drivers all the time because that's going to be insane. The new solution seems to be something called eBPF. I won't get into it because it's super technical and I'm running out of time. But it doesn't, there's support for it in the HID subsystem, but I'm not sure distro maintainers will have to answer that question for me. Is that actually shipped anywhere by default? Because at least on Fedora, I had to install udev-hid-bpf manually, and that just leads back to my same point that if we have device drivers that only exist in eBPF form, but they're not installed by default, then what are we doing here, right? So I think there's some ecosystem work to do in this regard, or someone needs to inform me, right? So just in conclusion, because I'm running out of time, I only have 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to people's questions. We are looking to more sources of funding. Some part of that feature, that giant, nice feature list that I mentioned before, was partially funded by Elenet. But we have more of a problem as we get into some more of the complex features. For example, we want to support like some of the really fancy statistics with like all these crazy features on the hardware, but we don't have test hardware for that, right? The EV has suggested that they buy that hardware, but that's also really expensive. Something that might be easier and also, more importantly, free is vendor cooperation, not just for test hardware, but maybe for developing kernel device drivers. Unlikely, but I still think it should be pursued. I haven't tried looking into that, so I don't have any results of that regard. I think it would also be cool if we can bully. That was a really interesting choice to end the sentence there. I think it'd be really, I think it'd be really cool if we bully more proprietary software into supporting Linux. I didn't go over it in my talk. Like I said, I didn't really want to focus on the application side, but there is still a lot of applications that artists like using that do not support Linux and do not work in Wine. Please stop suggesting that. But also, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that works, but users don't really know about that yet. And as I even said before, there's also a lot of non-FOSS-oriented artists out there who are just using Linux. I don't know how. I think that's really cool, but there's no way to tell. So it might be interesting and also free for the marketing teams to sort of come up with a way for users to advertise that they're using KDE, right? That might be interesting, right? Especially if you use like Twitter-style social media, they have like hashtags. So maybe we could have like a hashtag made on KDE tag to show that they use KDE Plasma to make that artwork, right? I'm gonna skip through some of this, but I really wanted to go over this slide. The what can I do slide, right? If you're not a programmer, and even if you're not an artist, like what are some of the things I want you to take away? Number one, don't force people to use Linux. I'm sure I don't have to say that to anybody in this room, but there's been a lot of pushback on like FOSS bros. You know, you've seen these kind of posts where they'll just reply to this like Windows fail or whatever, and they're like, why don't you just use Linux? And then they explain why they don't use Linux, and it's usually, you know, proprietary software reasons. But like, I think instead we should lead by example. If there's artists out there who are using free software, you know, scream that at the top of your lungs that free software is cool and that you like using it, or just support artists who use alternate software to begin with, if you can somehow figure out that information. Also, number two, please stop people from using older distributions. Please, please, please. I keep seeing this all the time where somebody will try Debian for some reason, and then they complain that none of the drawing tablet stuff works. I mean, at least Debian now has 6.3, but it used to be way older. And no shade to these distributions, but it's just not fit for this. The graphics tablet infrastructure is just changing all the time. You really need the latest software. And of course, test and report bugs about the software. I love getting bug reports against the Quinn input subsystem and also the KCM. If you have problems with your software, please let us know. And that also goes for application developers too. So if you have an application that uses the drawing tablet features and there's something Quinn is doing or isn't doing that needs to be changed, please let us know. We'd love to hear it. Other than that, I think I'm done with my talk.
Woo, that's good timing there. We have questions in the room, it looks like, and there's also a couple of comments from chat. I'm going to start here with the Würzburg.
Quick questions about the bug situation. How do you get non-technical users, which most artists are, to actually report bugs unless it's crashing and you get Kcrash to submit a bug report? How do you motivate such a user to, or like how do you even inform them that they can report a bug?
Okay. I actually meant to focus on this in my talk a little bit more, but if you have a bug and you're not sure how to report it, I would just tell somebody, right? I don't just mean direct messaging me, but just telling, because obviously I can't take everybody's reports, but just let somebody know, of course we have the discuss forum, which I also moderate. And people actually report a surprising amount of drawing tablet related issues there, not specifically crashes, but more like usability questions. And that's actually been great. I'm really surprised how many people take to the forums to talk about problems with the drawing tablet KCM, which I don't like to hear that there's problems, but I like to hear people reporting it, right?
So insofar as like the distribution things with eBPF, as far as I know, no one has ever asked anyone to preload that stuff and to make it work out of the box.
Well, now I'm asking you.
Yeah, well, file a ticket. Second thing, with the thing about using quote unquote older distributions, and yes, I agree with you, Debian Ubuntu, not a great place for that. But my recent experience, I was at SIGGRAPH, and I talked to a lot of artists and folks like that. And in that particular space, did the microphone just die? Oh, there we go. In that particular space, they pretty much do have to use an enterprise Linux platform, but one of the things that might be interesting is to talk about, like, for example, with using Alma Linux or RHEL or whatever, you have the latest KDE Plasma stack, and maybe we should start looking at qualifying that your tablet support is actually working there, and if there's issues there, we can try to get those fixed rapidly so that the artists can use those even with the platform that their company makes them use.
Yeah, like we can. I kind of get your point. I think that's a valid use case. My point was sort of more general. Like I'm talking about like the regular artist who maybe isn't professional. Like they're not going to get anything from using an older platform. They're only going to get more problems. But if we have like something like your case, that's something we can do. But of course, generally, it's better just to have everything. And I forgot to mention it too, but a lot of it is just recency bias because there's so much stuff changing. Like 2 years from now, using an older distribution would be like completely fine, right? It's just once everything is settled,
So chat is well actuallying that CachyOS ships eBPF by default, and that Debian just got hid BPF, which may be backported.
Awesome, that's great to hear. That's the best kind of actually I can hear is that people are actually shipping this by default because yes, because the current HID ePBF like set of, I don't know what you call these, ePBF files actually contain a lot of useful device support. Like I recently had a report from a model that would have been fixed by UDEV HID BPF. Wow, that is terrible to say. But yeah. If it's shipped by default, then that would fix that user's problem, for example.
Okay, I'll hand off to Ax.
Last quick question. Can you please share the Kongi with the French as a wallpaper? Because I really need that for my work activity. Thanks.
Yes, the presentation is available online for people who are not him, but I'll speak to him specifically about getting his hands on that.
Okay, my question is, do we know where artists are hanging out and congregating and learning about Linux and Wayland? And do we have like a direct line to them where we can communicate?
I missed the first part of your question, but you're talking about artists, right?
Yes.
Okay, not other kinds of people. I'm sure this is how to phrase this. So we don't have direct lines to these people. I do sometimes, right? I try to build these kind of connections. I might have skipped over the slides, but I wanted to note that building relationships with non-FOSS artists is actually really nice, and it's, you know, we all know the typical like FOSS artists, and we already, of course, have great communications channels with them, but they're not everybody, right? And artists are also influencers, and like as David put it, ambassadors, so having them rep KDE is really important. But I think the direct line is kind of weird. I would figure the closest direct line that we have with them is our social media accounts, right? So maybe we should try using those more. I mean, we've used it some, the promo team has used it some to push some art stuff, but maybe we should do more, right? And also another direct line is them also pinging the social media accounts as well with questions. As is typical with like normally proprietary products, as I say, in case no one uses like social media a lot.
Yeah, I wanted to contribute to the question that Nick just asked, because shameless plug, PenPod is going to have its conference coming up in October, I think. It's called PenPod Fest, and good place to find a lot of artists that are working in, you know, open design, and in general, it seems to me that artists follow the application, and if you have, there are venues like that you know are speaking even about, for example, Adobe products or other new emerging things like Figma and stuff like that. Those are places that you would find a lot of artists in general. So that would be my plug there. But PenPod particularly is having its own conference, and that would be something cool to explore.
Do you have a response to that?
No, that's just cool.
All right, that's just cool is a great way to wrap up this room for Academy. That does, in fact, wrap it up for room 2 for day 2 of Academy. You can join us in 10 minutes in room 1 for all the sponsor talks and other fun wrap-up stuff. Thanks you for attending, and see you out there.